Oh, thanks. Well, it's nice to see a bunch of faces who I know and a bunch of folks in the audience who I actually have never met before. So at some point, I hope to meet all of you today. Thanks very much for coming, and thanks to MDA for putting this together and giving us a platform for talking, and thanks very much for everybody attending. I wanted to take a little bit of a left turn. We spend a lot of time talking about strength and muscle structure and function and ways to decrease inflammation and things like that. I want to take a little bit of a different tack today and talk a little bit as well about non-muscle parts of the DMD world and sort of how that impacts sort of our concepts of quality of life and family health and community participation. Let's see if I do this right. Oh, look at that. Okay, so so one of the things that we, ways that we approach the concepts of health in health and disease in the Duchenne world is, we sort of think about this patient-centric model, and this, the DMD care consideration sort of takes these ideas of the patient as the center of the DMD universe, and then there's the family support and sort of clinical care, and then there are all these different domains that we have with diagnostics and orthopedic management, the psychosocial part, and cardiac and pulmonary. And this starts to look very familiar, actually, to sort of classical, some of the more well-regarded child development and family development models from the human development world. And this is from Uri Bronfenbrenner. It's sort of in the 80s, and this was what's called a bioecological model, or a family systems theory model of human development. And it basically kind of looks the same with the participant or the individual person in the middle, and then they're surrounded by sort of this family and school layer of the onion, and the health services and church groups and people in your community, things like that. And then you have sort of the greater system of the community in which you live, with available health resources and educational resources and the political system and these kind of things, and how this changes over time as well. And it's a way for us to think about elements of typical human development and how they influence us as we move through our lives. So quality of life, this is a big thing, right? Because now we're talking about all these new therapeutic interventions. And one of the things that the FDA or the European Medicines Agency, these different regulators keep asking us is, okay, well, you can make somebody stronger. That's fantastic. You can make them breathe better, improve their lung volume, yada, yada, yada. Does it make them feel better? Right? And so this word quality of life is thrown around a lot. And we haven't been very good at interpreting what that means. And so a lot of folks, even now, we have these quality of life questionnaires, which are like, how fast can you climb a set of stairs? Or are you able to scratch the top of your head? Things like that. Well, is that really quality of life? It's really more about self-reporting mobility, right? Activities of daily living, things that you do to move yourself around in your environment. But is that really quality of life? I would suggest probably not. And if you look, actually, this is a study that we did as a part of our Duchenne Natural History study with the Synergy group. So we looked at mobility over time. And these are the various stages of DMD that Dr. McDonald was talking about earlier, with sort of early childhood and nearly fully mobile, all the way to folks sort of in this stage 6 who are in power chairs and potentially on nighttime or full-time non-invasive ventilation. And the actual mobility and their self-reported mobility using one of these quality of life tools is pretty limited once you get past a certain stage. But if you look at something that we think about as a prime part of a quality life, which is self-reported happiness, what do we see here? It doesn't actually differ that much. And so can we say that happiness is directly related to mobility? Well, this is the same people answering the same different sets of questions. Maybe not. So there's something else going on here, right? And we want to, so this is the challenge, because when we go to the FDA and say, oh, we made people stronger, if we take you from here to here, but you're happy is kind of all in the same range, then we go, well, We don't know if we made people happier. We don't know if we needed to actually make people happier, but we know that the mobility part is important. So this is so maybe mobility isn't directly quality of life. So what are other things that impact QOL? So we have this kind of concept of how we go from strength leads to mobility, leads to participation. And maybe participation in activities is more related to quality of life than just strength. So it's an indirect effect, but it's not the whole thing. So what are other things that can affect an individual's participation? We have strength. We have fatigue, which is something that we're starting to measure in some of the clinical trials a little bit. We have mobility. We do a good job with that. We have health, which we're sort of starting to look at now with some of these post-marketing studies, and if you're on steroids or not on steroids, do you have a difference in rates of hospitalization for upper respiratory infection, for instance? Maybe that's a better indicator of health, and something that we're not quite looking at, but moving in that direction. And then behavior, which is another issue. And so behavior, this is one that families talk to me all the time about, well, we're in this trial or we're starting this drug, and we have these behavioral challenges at home with our child. Well, this is a normal part of childhood and growing up, but there is dystrophin in the brain, and this is something that's overlooked by a lot of families, but a lot of clinicians as well. So DMD doesn't just affect strength and mobility, but it also can have some subtle effects on overall cognitive abilities and behavior. So we see typically, people describe this as autism-like. It's not my favorite characterization because there are some things that are autism-like behaviors that are not directly linked to an autism diagnosis, even though we have common factors that might look similar. But I'll get back to that in a minute. But you have we know from a lot of kids with DMD that they may, as younger children, seem like they're not quite acting their age. They're a little bit, they're acting a little young for their biological age. We have emotional outbursts. We have anxiety is a big problem. Behavioral rigidity, challenges with attention, some compulsiveness or repetitive behaviors, and also some issues with social disinterest or social withdrawal. And these are things that can, not always, but can create challenges in social group participation, things like this, and they can be actually pretty stressful for the family unit. And so at least a part of this, if you combine mobility challenges and behavioral challenges, this can put a lot of stress on a family. And so let's take a look at that real briefly. So again, DMD, it's a multi-system disorder. So you're going to hear a lot about cardiac function and lung function and muscle strength and probably bone health and things like that today. But I also want to point to let's not forget about the other side of the spinal cord and the brain. So we typically see, again, there's variability within the typical population, right? And we see also variability in a population of kids with DMD. So we will, many of the studies show that in terms of just sort of cognitive ability that guys with DMD on average are a little lower on the functional scale than the typical person in the population, but that doesn't mean everybody. And it's about a third fall into kind of an official designation of cognitive delay. Language delay is one of the things that parents report is sort of a first and early concern of one of the first things that they kind of notice about their child as they're growing, like, oh, they're not quite talking yet, and maybe they have some motor delay, and it's in that stage where parents start to go, I wonder if some things needs follow-up. And then we do see that some social and behavioral delay, and we see a lot higher percentage of the DMD population of people who are have coincidences of diagnoses of ADD and ADHD and some autism spectrum kinds of behaviors and disorders. So, and it really varies depending on the study that's done. It's anywhere between like 3% and 20% of the population, depending on the diagnostics and the tests and the evaluations used. So even within the literature themselves and the pieces of the studies that are out there, we're still not doing a great job of characterizing this. So, but we know that it's increased in frequency and that it does seem to be somewhat variable. So, developmental assessments for kids with DMD, we're talking primarily in the younger kids. Oops. Here we go. As children enter the care system, what we want to see is that there's also concurrent with that a set of neuropsychological evaluations, just to get a baseline, to get an idea of whether there are concerns beyond motor challenges for kids, preferably before they get into the school system network. But are there things that we need to try to figure out how we can reinforce from a behavioral, attentive standpoint, from a social interaction standpoint, things like that. And these should be done on a regular basis because this is a dynamic system and we all learn how to get along with peers, and we all learn how to self-regulate and control our emotions and things like that, right? It's just that some guys with DMD may need a little extra help with that, and there are interventions that can assist in those kinds of areas. So I have a couple of MDA-funded studies, actually, I want to talk about. One is the MDA Clinical Research Network that Dr. Ann Connolly, who was at Washington University and is now out in Ohio, did this really nice study looking at infants and toddlers with DMD and using the Bailey test of infant and toddler development, which is a very common assessment for little kids. Had Bailey assessments done on these little guys at baseline and then 6 and 12 months. And what did we see? Actually, she was able to confirm with the Bailey, which is one of the better validated tests, that yes, we do see about a 1 standard deviation shift towards lower levels of function in the motor and the language and the cognitive abilities in these infants. Remember, these are little ones. These are like 12 months old to 24, 36 months, 30 months, I think. And so we see that on average, cognitive scale scores are a little bit lower. We know that, but they're stable. We also see that those, the expressive language scores are also pretty stable over time. They're actually not that much lower than your typical population, although we do see some evidence of delays even in the younger kids. And we see the same thing in the socio-emotional scores. A little less, perhaps, effective at socio-emotional skills and regulation than typical peers at the same ages, but overall, just something to watch and to consider on an individual basis. This part's really interesting, though, which is receptive language, which is the, hey, are you listening to me? What are you, paying attention is hard. And listening is hard, and we all learn how to do that as we grow. And so there's definitely an evidence that in kids with DMD that listening and attention and language processing part is a little bit delayed to a point where folks would definitely notice it. But we also see that over time, as kids age, they kind of catch up. So receptive language is not a fixed deficit, it's a learning process, and it just takes a little bit longer in kids with DMD than in typically developing toddlers and young children. So this is another study that was done by Dr. Connolly and by Amy Wagner, who was a doctoral student in our group a couple of years ago, and she's now gone on to be the director of the Early Childhood Learning Program and Center at University of Wisconsin. And Dr. Wagner did a study with MDA, sort of nationwide as an online study, looking at these developmental screener self-assessment tools. These are tools that are designed to help people, self-diagnose concern in different areas that they might then go and take to a provider and say, we did this self-assessment. It looks like my child is a little low in this, this area or that area. What can we do to kind of take a look and do some formal evaluations? And they're typically used in families starting to, who are concerned about autism-like behaviors, but they're used in other childhood developmental disorders as well. So so using the Ages and Stages questionnaire, which is, again, it's kind of like a self-report version of the Bailey, but it has it has cognitive and behavioral components as well. What she was able to see was that the DMD group here did definitely score in the concern range much more frequently than typically developing peers in not only gross motor and fine motor, which we would expect, right, with people with some degree of weakness and motor challenges, but also in the communication domain and the personal social domain and overall for the whole score. And remember, again, these are children between the ages of 3 and 5 or 3 and 7. And then looking at this, what's called the Strengths and Difficulties Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire. This is a questionnaire that's designed to look a little bit more at the social and behavioral aspects of developmental disorders. We also see that the kids with DMD, and again, these are the younger children with DMD, score higher, about 46% of the Duchenne population in this study overall scored in a range of concern where these challenges across emotional symptoms and conduct problems and peer problems would have been noticeable and created some notable difficulties in day-to-day life, versus about 6% of the typically developing group that was the control group in this population. So we see, looking at the severe risk groups, actually the only kids with DMD who fell into the severe group, they fell into the social motivation challenge group. And we see this a lot. We see sort of social withdrawal, and we see some communication with others. When you're with a group of peers or a family who you're very comfortable with, communication is not a problem, but then when you get out to a group of sort of new people or peers in novel situations, that there's some social withdrawal that can sort of impact the ability of guys with DMD to effectively interact in new situations and interact with peers. And if you kind of lower that to the mild risk category, then you also see issues and higher scores in the restricted interests, social communication and interaction, and on the total scores overall. So overall, what does this suggest? This suggests that our guys with DMD, if we're looking at the infants and toddlers, show lower but stable scores in cognitive and expressive language and social emotional domains, and the receptive language is lower but improves over time. So, and what do we see from the online screener study? Even though kids who are scoring in are not scoring in a range that would suggest that they have autism-like behaviors, they are showing that they have at-risk behaviors that are likely to lead to daily challenges in communication and social and peer conduct and social motivation and peer relationships and restricted interests and repetitive behaviors that could cause some degree of concern or challenge within the family and also kind of over time for kids from an educational standpoint. So what does this tell us? This tells us, okay, there are therapeutic programs and early Head Start programs and school-based programs that are really designed to address these kind of issues. These are common things that we see in kids with developmental disability. And there are interventions through playgroups and peer groups and different kinds of training mechanisms that are really effective at addressing these kinds of issues. So behavioral assessment and care shouldn't be an afterthought, should be one of the very first things that we start to look at in these young kids. And as we transition them into school, it should stay on the radar. And it should be a regular part of everybody's sort of DMD care, both not just from the medical standpoint, but from the social and educational standpoint as well. So how does this tie into quality of life? So addressing behavioral issues, social contact, peer relationships, those kind of things are likely to help to optimize social participation. And if you remember, that link between sort of dysfunction and quality of life, participation is a big part of that. So getting into the part where you're actually participating in day-to-day activities in a normative, typical kind of way is our goal. So maybe this is a better way to think about quality of life then, is you've got strength and function and mobility and activities and participation. Then you have cognition and behavior, and you've got the social motivation part, and you've got opportunity to participate, which is why we have IEPs and why we have the plans through the schools and things like that, is because we want to say, okay, we have some challenges, but let's get Johnny into an environment with a plan where we can kind of maximize chances for success, maximize opportunities for interaction, development of peer groups, effective learning, that kind of thing. So let's think about this from a bioecological system standpoint then. We have things that are definitely challenges that impact quality of life. And this is family quality of life, because remember, nobody exists just as a little single point in the universe away from everybody else. We're all embedded in some sort of family or peer unit, right? So we have things that are impacting caregivers. We've got physical stress, fatigue, health, emotional stress, grief, sorrow, worry about the future. There's financial stress with having a child with a developmental disability. There's a lot that we ask people to do to show up to doctor's visits and show up to school visits, and you've got 4,000 other things that are extra that you've got to try to fit into your schedule, so you don't necessarily have time to get everything done. And it's disruptive of your everyday life. And there's also an issue with role expectations and kind of balancing your relationships with other members of your family, your spouse or your parents or the grandparents or the siblings, in terms of there are differing roles from what is maybe typical and normative for a family with a child with DMD or some other sort of developmental disability. And so you have to negotiate that, and you have to teach people about it, and it is something that the whole system has to learn and sort of recalibrate so that you can present these sort of optimize your child or your own, if you're an adult, environment so that you can be successful. Siblings might have less time with parents or caregivers to spend on their own individual activities. They may have their own expectations within the family of caregiving. This is something that shouldn't be overlooked. There's worry on the part of siblings, stress, grief, and there are often, we see with families of children with developmental disorders, there are differences in the kids' ability to become independent as they age. And there's also a difference in families' desire to grant that ability to become independent as they age. And then there's the actual physical potential limitations as well. Extended family is often a challenge. They may have their own care needs. They may have their own expectations about what an adult child is supposed to do with their parents, and then you have an adult child who then has somebody who requires, maybe more care and additional attention at home. That can detract from, well, I thought my kids were going to take care of me when I was old. And they might also not know how they can assist, and how can I help, and how can I be a part of this different family unit that's not something that I had anticipated my kids were going to have to grow up as adult parents with with an individual with a disability. So they may not know how to negotiate that supporting role. But there are also lots of really positive reinforcing factors about this kind of social support too. Families can be very communicative. They can be really incredible, really supportive teams. And they can, there are opportunities to share and discuss feelings, to focus on the health and wellness of the whole family, to build resilience and autonomy and self-reliance not only in kids with DMD or adults with DMD, but also in siblings and parents and grandparents. And often what we see is that families of people with developmental disorders, with mobility disorders, also have report that they have closer and more meaningful relationships with their immediate family because there's a lot more contact. And there's a lot more focus on things that people feel are important in life. And this is a big benefit as well. The ability to advocate for each other, the ability to share and search for resources, and basically just to be there to help out when needed. In terms of the community, then the family's embedded in the community, right? So we have resources that are outside. You've got plans and programs through employers, healthcare resources, counseling, medical care, school resources through IEPs, therapy services, recreational groups and activities, power chair soccer. I'm hearing a lot about power chair soccer. I'm very excited about it. It's really cool. And then you've got this sort of state, national, regional level with social and developmental and medical programs and things like that. So this is all about, part of it is about medical care, but a lot of the programs and services that are out there are about enhancing participation, because we know it's the participation part. It's the part about getting out into the community. It's the part about having friends. It's the part about feeling supported in your day-to-day life and having the resources that you need to get through on a day-to-day basis. That's the part that that's the big focus here. And so this support web can enhance participation, facilitate positive quality of life. That's why we have social services. This is why we have multidisciplinary clinics with behavioral providers in them. This is why MDA has programs to help help older teens transition to adult care and find resources and things like that. This, then, we can't overlook the fact that, again, going back to that Bronfenbrenner model that we saw in the first set of slides, changes over time. The family's needs change over time. The patient's needs or person with DMD's needs change over time. So this is a dynamic system. This is something that we have to keep watch over. We have to constantly adjust based on what the family and what the individual needs at any given time. For a toddler, for young children, it's behavioral interventions. It's how to get into a play group without disrupting the play and going over and whacking somebody on the head in order to enter the play situation versus coming in and saying, hey, can I play with you? Those kinds of things. Whereas for a young adult, it might be services to help get around on a college campus, or to help negotiate public transportation, or to figure out how to negotiate getting self-care, getting care assistance as an adult so that they can maintain independence. But this is where we should be thinking about when we talk about quality of life, is these kinds of issues and how they impact the lives of people with DMD and their families. Strength is a little part of that. I want to thank, I'll end there because I know we're running a little bit behind. I just want to thank all the folks who were involved in those couple of studies. And we had funding and support from Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, MDA, NIH, a bunch of different collaborators at both UC Davis, University of Wisconsin, around the country, in different parts of the MDA Clinical Research Network. And thank you very much.